Last week I was in Ottawa visiting my family, and as part of the trip, Mom and I drove down to southern Ontario to visit one of my sisters and her family. And I knew I was going to be there on Sunday, so I asked ahead for permission to be able to con-celebrate at Mass, which is basically like being a wallflower, showing up and doing nothing. And so I was delighted to be able to do that for a change. I walked into the sacristy to get vested before Mass, and the priest was so gracious. He's like, "Welcome, Father Simon. We're so happy that you're here. Would you like to preach today?" It's like 10 minutes before Mass. And I was like, "Well, surely, you've got something prepared. You go." And he's like, No, Father Simon, we want you to preach. I heard you're an amazing preacher." It's like, usually I have a bit of time to prepare. And so I asked for a pen and paper, and started scribbling. He gave me this little scrap piece of paper, and he said, "Oh, by the way, we have 4 confirmations today as well." No problem. So 3 minutes before Mass, I've got my little scrap piece of paper. I get to the back, and I see the deacon there, and I said, "Hi, Father asked me to preach today. Were you planning on preaching?" And he looks at me and he's like, "I just got ordained yesterday." It's like, who's running this show, So anyways, we process in, make the sign of the cross, and again, Father is so gracious. He's like, it is our great joy to welcome Father Simon Lobo, all the way from Halifax, Nova Scotia, the pastor of the famous St. Benedict Parish. And then he starts reading my entire bio. Like he had downloaded it from the internet, where I was born, where I went to high school, where I was ordained, etc., etc. The author of Divine Renovation Apprentice, and he's going down. I'm getting more and more embarrassed. Finally, please put your hands together to welcome Father Simon Lobo. And so then he gestures to me to come over and meet him at the altar, and he hands me a single red rose. Now, I've never seen that show, but you know that show, The Bachelorette? It's a good thing I was wearing a mask, because there's all kinds of different facial expressions happening. And the only thing that made it slightly less awkward was he then introduced the brand new deacon, who also was given a rose. So I was kind of watching what the deacon did with his rose. I'm standing there, at my pew. I finally set it down gently. I was thinking about that whole experience, and I realized, they treated me like royalty. I had to go all the way down to this small church in southern Ontario, but they recognized me for all of my greatness, They really rolled out the red carpet for me. No, I'm speaking tongue-in-cheek, of course, but there are some people that we recognize as royalty. Isn't that true? The modern-day kings and queens, the dukes and duchesses, what we call celebrities. I'm talking about actors, professional athletes, musicians, politicians, people we recognize, people who are well-known. They're in the news. We know their bios, their credentials. They've done something incredible. And so it's things that are obvious to us and observable, and so they are like royalty in a sense. But I think sometimes the greatest people of all go unrecognized and unnoticed. And that's actually what we have today in our gospel, this story, this conversation that takes place between Pontius Pilate and Jesus. And the situation, Jesus has been arrested. He's already been on trial by different authorities. He's been beaten up a little bit, punched probably in the face. He's been up all night. He's looking ragged. And Pilate is there, who's a Roman governor, a representative of Caesar. He would have been mixing it up with royalty all the time, going to all the parties. He knew what to look for. And yet he's face to face with Jesus Christ, the King of the universe. And he doesn't recognize him. In fact, he has to ask the question, "Are you the King of the Jews?" He's really asking because there's nothing obvious about Jesus that would give that away. He's not wearing fancy robes. He doesn't have a crown. He's not sitting on a throne. He doesn't have much money. He doesn't live in a castle. He doesn't own vast portions of land. He doesn't have an army. Pilate is not able to recognize the royalty of Jesus. And I think many of us probably know people who aren't able to recognize Jesus in all of his royalty. Now, we are celebrating this great feast today, Christ the King. And in our readings, if you look at all of our readings, we're actually presented with two very different images of Christ the King. One is, as I've been describing in the gospel, Jesus, who is this hidden and humble king, unrecognizable. And the other, which we find in the first reading, the second reading, the psalm, this Jesus as king who is glorious. Just here's a sampling of a few lines. In Daniel, I saw one like a son of man coming with the clouds of heaven. Now, if you saw somebody descending from heaven on a cloud, would you notice? I mean, come on, like that'd be pretty obvious and observable, right? We'd be paying attention. Or the Lord is king, he's robed in majesty. Or in Revelations, to him be glory and dominion forever and ever. And I could go on, but I hope you're starting to see there's this contrast between the Jesus who is unrecognizable as king before Pilate and this other glorious Jesus who is all-powerful and undeniable. And we might be asking, well, what gives? Like, it almost seems like there's a contradiction here. But I actually think both are true. This Jesus who is glorious and unmistakable, we will encounter at the end of time, what we call the second coming of Christ. And for those who have had trouble accepting him or following him, it will be so obvious at that point, they will have a stark decision before them whether to follow or not. And we might get tiny glimpses of this glorious Jesus in our life right now, but for the most part, we experience this hidden and humble king. The one who Pilate couldn't even recognize when he was eyeball to eyeball with him. And you might ask, like, why is that? Why does Jesus remain hidden? Even atheists might throw this question out, like, if Jesus is God, why doesn't he do something that's obvious and observable? Maybe you've asked a similar question. Well, I think the answer to that question is love. Love demands freedom. And I stumbled across this story by Soren Kierkegaard, who is a famous Christian philosopher from the 19th century. He wrote this story called The King and the Maiden. And I just want to read for you an excerpt from this story. Suppose there was a king who loved a humble maiden. This king was like no other king. Every statesman trembled before his power. No one dared breathe a word against him, for he had the strength to crush all opponents. And yet, this mighty king was melted by love for a humble maiden. How could he declare his love for her? In an odd sort of way, his kingliness tied his hands. If you brought her to the palace and crowned her head with jewels and clothed her body in royal robes, she would surely not resist. No one dared resist him. But would she love him? She would say she loved him, of course, but would she truly? Would she be happy at his side? How could he know? If he rode to her forest cottage in his royal carriage with an army escort, waving bright banners, that too would overwhelm her. He did not want a cringing subject. He wanted a lover. And so what did he do? get this, this king, disguises himself as a beggar. And he goes alone to this maiden in her cottage in the woods, not to take her by force, but to woo her with love. And I think this is a great analogy to this story of Jesus the King of the universe, who comes to us in this hidden and humble way, as disguised as a humble beggar. And I think nowhere is this more evidence than in the Eucharist, the sacrament of the body and blood of Jesus, hidden under this sacrament, appearing to be a mere wafer of bread. Jesus is the King, and he's present to us. He's right now in this tabernacle, this gold box in our chapel. And it's just occurred to me that here we are just a few meters away, this busy intersection, Radcliffe and Dunbrack, and every single day, there's probably hundreds, if not thousands of people who drive by here, and they don't recognize the royalty of Jesus the King, who is so close. And how many of us, too, we don't recognize Jesus as he is the King of the universe. I mean, I take for granted the fact that he's humbled himself in this way, like a simple beggar. And yet, he waits. He waits so patiently for us. He's not like a ruthless monarch who's demanding that we cower before him. He's this patient, loving beggar waiting for us. And I think for me over the years, one of the things that has helped me to cultivate an awareness, that's helped me to recognize the royalty of Jesus, has been to spend time in prayer, and specifically a kind of prayer called Eucharistic Adoration. Spending time before Jesus in this way. So what is this? We have this fancy kind of gold container, we call it a monstrance, and we take a host that's consecrated during Mass and place it in the monstrance on the altar. And people can come to pray. It's almost like the best way I've heard this described is during Mass, there's this moment where the priest, you'll see Father Alex do this in a few minutes, he will elevate the host, and it's like a freeze frame of that moment where the host is there, and we can gaze upon Jesus, we can adore him, and we can just be quiet in his presence and receive peace just by being near to him. I've heard some people describe it as spiritual sunbathing. So whatever image works for you, but it's this wonderful gift to be able to pray in this way. And I know so many people, they've been transformed by spending time in Eucharistic adoration. I think of one lady, she wasn't even Catholic, and yet she was invited to come to this time of adoration, and she was overcome by the presence of love. I wonder if she encountered this king who loved her enough to humble himself as a beggar. So we want everybody to have the chance, even if you're not Catholic, you're welcome to come and pray in this way. And so what we're going to do is we're going to extend the hours we have for Eucharistic adoration on Wednesdays from 9 to 9. And in order to do this, we want to ask for 2 people to commit to a door for each of the time slots. More are welcome, and people are free to drop in throughout. But it's really this chance to see this as a ministry of prayer, to say, you know what, I got an appointment with Jesus the King, and I'm going to go and spend time in prayer with him. And you can find out more after Mass in the foyer. You can ask questions. There's a place where you can sign up. A few months ago, we were praying for God's vision for this church and for its future. And one of the things that became so clear was that God wants us to grow in our culture of prayer here at St. Benedict's Parish. And that's why we're in this series, Up the Mountain, this series where we want to talk more about prayer, because if we're going to have any kind of impact out there, we need to lay the foundation, the bedrock of prayer. When I was a kid growing up, we went to this parish that had a Eucharistic Adoration chapel, and it was 24/7 for a time. So people could come and pray day or night before Jesus in this beautiful way. And so our family was at the church often, and it'd be like a Saturday morning, and Mom would be going to the photocopier room. She'd be photocopying music for Mass, and so us kids, we were kind of rambunctious. My other siblings, that is, by the way, I was always well behaved. But Dad would take us down to the Adoration Chapel, and sometimes just for a couple minutes, like 5 minutes or less. But I'd watch my dad kneel down before Jesus, the King, and lower himself in worship. And as kids, we'd follow his example. And what I've come to see is, from a young age, I was being trained to recognize royalty, to recognize Jesus as King, even in the most humblest of places. And I can see, looking back, that Jesus Christ, he was the King of that parish. And Jesus was the King of my parents' lives. And Jesus has become the King of my heart. And he wants to be the King in each and every one of our hearts. And so, as I've been praying about this, I had this vision of our church, and you can close your eyes if it helps. One day, our church being a place of Eucharistic adoration where there's prayer 24/7. And I pictured this young father coming to our church, driving out here in the middle of the night for his shift to pray, from 2 a.m. to 3 a.m. or whatever it was, and he kneels down. He's entered the throne room of the King, kneeling before Jesus. And he's praying, begging for courage to be the husband and the father that God has created him to be. He's praying for his wife, for his children, for all of their needs. He's praying for all those people in his life who do not know Jesus as King. He's praying for the mission of St. Benedict Parish. He's lifting up the whole world in prayer. And as I've gone back to that image, I've started to see others join him. Single people, married couples coming to kneel down, religious, older people, entire families coming, teenagers from the youth group, young adults, all coming to kneel and worship in the throne room before Jesus Christ, the King of the universe.